Welcome back to the channel. Today we are diving deep into one of the greatest action films ever made. We are talking about The Rock, the 1996 Hollywood blockbuster that completely changed the game for action cinema in the 90s. This is the movie that made Michael Bay a household name, brought two absolute legends together on screen, and delivered one of the most thrilling 2 hours and 16 minutes ever put on film. So sit back, relax, and let us get into everything you need to know about The Rock. Overview. The Rock is a 1996 American action thriller film directed by Michael Bay, produced by Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer, and written by David Weisberg, Douglas S. Cook, and Mark Rosner. The film comes from the United States of America and was produced under the Hollywood Pictures and Don Simpson/Jerry Bruckheimer Films production banner, distributed by Buena Vista Pictures Distribution. The movie is set primarily in San Francisco and on the legendary Alcatraz Island, which is one of the most iconic and recognizable locations in American history. What makes this film stand apart from other action movies of its time is not just the explosive sequences or the breathtaking location. It is the fact that the story carries genuine emotional weight. The villain is not a cartoon character. The heroes are flawed and unlikely. And the stakes feel real from the very first frame. The Rock not only set new standards for the genre but also delivered a cinematic experience that remains thrilling, intelligent, and emotionally resonant to this day. The film runs for 136 minutes, was made on a production budget of $75 million, and was shot entirely within the United States, with principal filming taking place in and around the San Francisco Bay Area and on Alcatraz Island itself. The soundtrack was composed by the legendary Hans Zimmer along with Nick Glennie Smith and Harry Gregson Williams, giving the film an unforgettable musical identity that many people still recognize to this day. Plot details. The story begins with Brigadier General Francis Xavier Hummel, a highly decorated United States Marine Corps officer who has spent his entire career serving his country with distinction. Hummel holds 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Silver Stars, and the Medal of Honor. He is not a terrorist by nature. He is a man who has been broken by a system that used his soldiers, sent them on classified covert missions behind enemy lines, and then abandoned them when things went wrong. 15 of his men were slaughtered during one such mission, and the government not only refused to acknowledge their deaths but denied their families any compensation whatsoever. Hummel went through every legal and political channel available to him, through the chain of command, through Congress, through Senate committees, and was denied at every turn. On top of all of this, he had recently lost his wife Barbara, and with nothing left to lose, he decided to take matters into his own hands. Hummel assembles a group of rogue Force Recon Marines and executes a bold and dangerous plan. He and his men steal a cache of deadly VX nerve gas rockets from a military storage facility. VX gas is among the most lethal chemical weapons ever created, capable of killing thousands of people within minutes of exposure. With these weapons in hand, Hummel and his men seize control of Alcatraz Island, taking 81 civilian tourists hostage and locking them in the old prison cells. From this position, Hummel issues an ultimatum to the Pentagon and the FBI. He demands $100 million from a secret military slush fund, money that he intends to distribute to his men and to the families of the soldiers who were killed on those covert missions. If the government refuses to pay within a set time frame, he will launch the VX rockets directly into the populated city of San Francisco, potentially killing up to 70,000 innocent civilians. The United States government is now in an impossible position. They cannot publicly negotiate with a military officer who has gone rogue. They cannot let San Francisco burn. So the FBI and the Pentagon put together a covert infiltration team made up of elite Navy SEALs, with the mission of sneaking onto the island, neutralizing the threat, and rescuing the hostages. However, there is one enormous problem. Alcatraz Island is a fortress. Its tunnels, passages, and hidden infrastructure are nearly impossible to navigate for anyone who does not already know the layout. And there is only one man alive who has ever successfully escaped from Alcatraz. That man is John Patrick Mason, a British national and former SAS operative who has been held in a secret federal prison for over 30 years without charge or trial. Mason was originally captured after stealing classified microfilm containing some of the most sensitive secrets in American history, including the truth behind the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Because the government could not publicly try him without exposing those secrets, they simply locked him away and threw away the key. Mason is sharp, experienced, dangerous, and deeply resentful of the system that imprisoned him. But he is also the only person who can navigate Alcatraz from the inside. The FBI pairs Mason with Dr. Stanley Goodspeed, a brilliant but somewhat nerdy biochemist who works for the Bureau specializing in chemical weapons. Stanley is not a field agent. He is a lab scientist who is more comfortable analyzing toxins than running through gunfire. He has just found out that his girlfriend Carla is pregnant, and his life is about to change forever. He is suddenly yanked out of his comfort zone and thrown into the most dangerous situation imaginable. Together, Mason and Goodspeed are inserted into Alcatraz along with a team of Navy SEALs. Things go disastrously wrong almost immediately. Hummel's men are highly trained and they are ready. The SEAL team is ambushed and wiped out in a brutal confrontation, leaving Mason and Goodspeed completely alone inside the island fortress with no backup, no extraction plan, and a ticking clock. The two men must now navigate the underground tunnels of Alcatraz, locate the VX rocket launchers, neutralize the threat, and somehow survive against an entire force of heavily armed soldiers. What unfolds is a relentless chain of action sequences, narrow escapes, firefights, explosions, and moments of unexpected humor and humanity, as two very different men are forced to rely on each other to save the lives of an entire city. As the story deepens, it becomes clear that not all of Hummel's men share his moral code. Two of his captains, Fry and Darrow, are not fighting for justice or for fallen soldiers. They are mercenaries who are simply in it for the money. When Hummel begins showing hesitation and signs of conscience, these men start pushing toward actually launching the rockets regardless of the consequences. This internal conflict within the villain's camp adds a fascinating layer to the story, turning what could have been a simple good versus evil narrative into something far more complex and emotionally interesting. Cast: Sean Connery plays John Patrick Mason, the mysterious and legendary British prisoner who is the only man to have ever escaped Alcatraz. Connery delivers one of the most charismatic and commanding performances of his post-James Bond career. He brings wit, charm, danger, and a quiet sadness to the role that makes Mason one of the most memorable characters in action film history. Nicolas Cage plays Dr. Stanley Goodspeed, the FBI biochemist thrust into the field under the most extreme circumstances. Cage brings his trademark nervous energy and quirky humor to the role, while also delivering genuine moments of courage and heart. His chemistry with Connery is electric and forms the emotional backbone of the entire film. Ed Harris plays Brigadier General Francis X. Hummel, the villain of the story. However, Harris plays the character with such depth, conviction, and controlled grief that it is nearly impossible to simply hate him. You understand him. You even sympathize with him to a degree. Harris gives one of the finest villain performances of the entire decade. David Morse plays Major Tom Baxter, Hummel's loyal second-in-command. John Spencer plays FBI Director James Womack, the bureaucratic authority figure overseeing the crisis. William Forsythe plays Special Agent Ernest Paxton. Michael Biehn plays Commander Charles Anderson, the leader of the Navy SEAL team. Vanessa Marcel plays Carla Pestalozzi, Stanley's pregnant girlfriend. Gregory Sporliter plays the ruthless Captain Fry, and Tony Todd plays the equally dangerous Captain Darrow. John C. McGinley plays Marine Captain Hendricks. Release date and box office. The Rock was released in theaters on June 7, 1996. It opened to massive numbers, debuting at number 1 at the domestic box office and holding that position with tremendous staying power. The film was made on a budget of $75 million and went on to gross approximately $134 million domestically and over $200 million internationally, bringing its worldwide total to approximately $335 million. This made it the fourth highest-grossing film of 1996 worldwide, sitting alongside massive films like Independence Day, Twister, and Mission Impossible. It was a commercial juggernaut by any measure and proved that audiences were hungry for smart, well-made, high-octane action films. Trailer and music. The theatrical trailer for The Rock was one of the most exciting and well-constructed trailers of the 90s. It showcased the scale of the action, the chemistry between Connery and Cage, and the menacing presence of Ed Harris, all set to the driving and intense musical score composed by Hans Zimmer, Nick Lenny Smith, and Harry Gregson Williams. The score itself became iconic. The main theme of the film is instantly recognizable to anyone who grew up watching action movies in the 90s and has been used in countless trailers, television programs, and promotional materials in the years since its release. Production and behind the scenes. The production of The Rock was not without its tensions. Director Michael Bay was a relatively young filmmaker at the time, coming off the success of Bad Boys in 1995. Disney executives who were overseeing the production through Hollywood Pictures frequently clashed with Bay over creative decisions. On one notable occasion, Sean Connery personally accompanied Bay to a meeting with the executives and stood up for the director, insisting that he was doing a great job and should be allowed to work without interference. This kind of behind-the-scenes dynamic speaks to the passion and commitment that everyone involved brought to this project. Quentin Tarantino was also an uncredited contributor to the screenplay, and British screenwriting duo Dick Clement and Ian La Frenais were brought in at Connery's personal request to rewrite and sharpen much of his dialogue. The film received generally positive reviews from critics and was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Sound at the 69th Academy Awards. It was later remade in India in 2003 under the title Qiyamat, City Under Threat, which speaks to its enduring global impact and influence. Final thoughts. The Rock is not just an action movie. It is a masterclass in blockbuster filmmaking. It has a villain with a real motivation. It has heroes who feel genuinely human and vulnerable. It has a setting that is both visually spectacular and dramatically perfect. It has a score that elevates every single scene. And it has 3 towering lead performances that hold the entire film together with tremendous skill and charisma. 30 years after its release, The Rock still holds up as one of the finest examples of the action thriller genre ever committed to film. If you have never seen it, you owe it to yourself to watch it. And if you have seen it before, you already know exactly why it deserves to be talked about again and again. The Rock, 1996, complete story. The beginning. Hummel's pain. The story of The Rock begins not with an explosion or a chase sequence, but with something far more powerful and quietly devastating. It begins with grief. We are introduced to Brigadier General Francis Xavier Hummel, a man who has given his entire life to the United States Marine Corps. He is not a young soldier. He is a seasoned, decorated, and deeply respected military leader who carries the weight of decades of service on his shoulders. As the film opens, we see Hummel standing alone at a grave. It is the grave of his wife, Barbara. She has just passed away, and in this moment, the audience understands something crucial about this man. He has lost his anchor. He has lost the one person who gave his life meaning beyond the battlefield. With Barbara gone, Hummel is left with nothing but his grief, his rage, and his unfinished mission to seek justice for the men he led into darkness and never brought home. For years, Hummel has been fighting a quiet and deeply personal war against the United States government. During his career, He led several classified covert operations, missions that never officially existed, carried out by soldiers whose names were never recorded in any public document. These men went into hostile territory, fought and died for their country, and when things went wrong, the government simply looked the other way. 15 of Hummel's Marines were killed during one particularly brutal mission. They were left behind enemy lines with no support, no rescue, and no acknowledgement. Their families received nothing. No compensation, no medals, no official recognition of their sacrifice. The government buried the truth to protect itself, and the families of those dead soldiers were left to suffer in silence and poverty. Hummel tried everything. He went through the proper chain of command. He appealed to senior military officials. He brought his case before congressional committees and Senate hearings. Every door was closed in his face. Every appeal was denied. The system that he had served so loyally for so many decades had betrayed him and the men who trusted him with their lives. And now, with his wife dead and his patients completely exhausted, Hummel has made a decision that will set the entire story in motion. The theft and the takeover. Hummel does not act alone. He has assembled a carefully selected group of former Force Recon Marines, men who served under him and share his rage at the system that discarded them. Together, they execute a bold and brilliantly coordinated raid on a United States military installation where a cache of deadly VX nerve gas rockets is being stored. VX is not an ordinary chemical weapon. It is one of the most lethal substances ever manufactured by human hands. A single drop on the skin is enough to kill a human being within minutes. The rockets loaded with this gas are capable of wiping out thousands of people in a densely populated urban area. Hummel and his men steal several of these rockets and disappear before the military can respond. With the weapons secured, Hummel moves to the next phase of his plan. He and his soldiers seize control of Alcatraz Island, the famous former federal penitentiary sitting in the middle of San Francisco Bay. The island is a tourist destination at this point in history, no longer an active prison, and on the day of the takeover, there are 81 civilian tourists visiting the site. Hummel's men round them all up and lock them in the old prison cells, turning them into hostages. The island is then fortified and the VX rockets are positioned in strategic launch points overlooking the city of San Francisco. From Alcatraz, Hummel broadcasts his ultimatum directly to the Pentagon and the FBI. He demands $100 million, drawn from a secret military discretionary fund that the government has long used for off-the-books operations. This money, Hummel insists, will be distributed to his surviving men and to the families of the Marines who died on those classified missions. He gives the government a strict deadline. If the money is not transferred, he will launch the VX rockets into San Francisco. The city has a population of hundreds of thousands of people. The casualties from a nerve gas attack of this scale could reach 70,000 or more. The threat is absolutely real, and the government knows it. The government's response. The news of Alcatraz's seizure hits the FBI and the Pentagon like a thunderbolt. FBI Director James Womack is immediately brought into the crisis and takes command of the response effort. The situation is unlike anything anyone has faced before. They are dealing with a highly trained military officer who knows exactly how the government operates, who has access to weapons of mass destruction, and who has taken a position that is nearly impossible to assault directly without triggering the very catastrophe they are trying to prevent. A plan is assembled. A team of elite Navy SEALs will be sent in covertly to infiltrate Alcatraz from beneath the waterline, neutralize Hummel's men, secure the VX rockets, and rescue the hostages. It sounds straightforward enough on paper, but there is an enormous problem standing in the way of this plan. Alcatraz is not just a prison. It is a labyrinth. The island contains a vast and complex network of underground tunnels, hidden passages, service corridors, and infrastructure that was built over decades and modified constantly throughout the prison's operational history. Navigating this underground maze without prior knowledge of its layout is essentially impossible. A team going in blind would be moving through darkness, disoriented, and vulnerable. There is only one man in the world who knows those tunnels from the inside. His name is John Patrick Mason. Introducing John Mason. John Patrick Mason is one of the most fascinating characters in the entire film. He is a British national, a former captain in the Special Air Service, which is the elite Special Forces unit of the British Army. In the 1960s, Mason was operating as an intelligence operative when he managed to steal a microfilm containing some of the most classified and explosive secrets in American government history. The contents of that microfilm reportedly included the full truth behind the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, as well as other information so sensitive that its public disclosure would have caused a national crisis of extraordinary proportions. Mason was captured by American authorities, but the government faced a devastating problem. They could not put him on trial. A trial would mean a public proceeding, and a public proceeding would mean that the contents of the microfilm might come to light. So instead of following any kind of legal process, they simply made Mason disappear. He was placed in a secret federal prison and held without charge, without trial, and without any public acknowledgement of his existence. He has been locked away for over 30 years, completely cut off from the world, denied any legal representation or due process whatsoever. He is, in every practical sense, a ghost. Mason is bitter. He is sharp, cynical, and distrustful of every government authority he has ever encountered. He has spent 3 decades watching the very system that imprisoned him operate with complete impunity, and he has absolutely no reason to cooperate with them now. However, Mason has something they desperately need. He was once held at Alcatraz during his years of secret imprisonment, and at some point during that time, he did something no one else has ever done. He escaped. He found a way out of the most secure facility in American history, navigating the tunnels and passages of that island with a skill and knowledge that no one else possesses. If anyone can guide a team into Alcatraz from below, it is Mason. FBI Director Womack goes to Mason personally and lays out the situation. The negotiation is tense and deeply uncomfortable. Mason has every reason to simply refuse. He owes the United States government absolutely nothing. In fact, the United States government owes him everything, including decades of his life. But Mason has a daughter, a young woman named Jade who has grown up without her father, and who does not even know he is still alive. Womack uses this as leverage, promising Mason a full pardon and the chance to finally be free and meet his daughter if he cooperates. Mason agrees, though his agreement comes with a barely concealed contempt for the men making the promises. Enter Stanley Goodspeed. While the Mason situation is being arranged, another key player is being pulled into the crisis. Dr. Stanley Goodspeed is an FBI biochemist who works out of the Bureau's laboratory in Washington. Stanley is not a field operative. He is a scientist, a man who is far more comfortable in a controlled laboratory environment than in any kind of dangerous situation. He is deeply knowledgeable about chemical and biological weapons, particularly nerve agents like VX, which makes him essentially irreplaceable for this mission. Someone needs to be on the ground at Alcatraz who actually knows how to handle and neutralize the VX rockets, and Stanley is the only person available who fits that description. Stanley's personal life is in an interesting state of transition at the moment. His girlfriend, Carla Pestalozzi, has just informed him that she is pregnant. Stanley is simultaneously thrilled and terrified by this news. He is a gentle, slightly awkward, deeply intelligent man who loves music and chemistry in equal measure. He is not someone who was ever supposed to find himself infiltrating a fortified island with a team of Navy SEALs and a mysterious British prisoner. But life has other plans for Stanley Goodspeed, and before he has had time to fully process Carla's announcement, he is on a plane heading toward the most dangerous situation he has ever faced. The infiltration of Alcatraz. Mason, Goodspeed, and a team of Navy SEALs are assembled and briefed. The plan is to approach Alcatraz underwater and enter the island through the network of tunnels that Mason used during his original escape years ago. It is a dangerous approach even before they encounter any resistance. The underwater insertion requires precise timing, skilled navigation, and the ability to move through confined spaces in complete darkness. During the preparations and transport phase, Mason makes several attempts to escape. He is not yet committed to this mission in any genuine sense. He is playing a game of survival and opportunity, looking for any chance to slip away and disappear. These escape attempts create a chaotic and darkly entertaining sequence of events, including a spectacular car chase through the streets of San Francisco that becomes one of the film's most memorable scenes. Mason, briefly free and moving through the city, is eventually recaptured, but not without causing considerable destruction and demonstrating exactly what kind of man he is. He is not a man who goes quietly. Once the team is finally assembled and the insertion begins, the mission immediately faces severe complications. Hummel's men are not amateurs. They are trained military operators who have planned extensively for exactly this kind of response from the government. The SEAL team is ambushed inside the tunnels and in the shower room area of the old prison. What follows is a brutal and devastating firefight in which the entire SEAL team is systematically wiped out. It is a shocking sequence, because the audience has been led to believe that these highly trained soldiers represent the cavalry. When they are gone, the full weight of the situation crashes down. There is no more cavalry. There is no backup plan. There are only 2 men left on the island who are not under Hummel's command. A weathered and imprisoned British spy, and a biochemist from Washington who has never fired a weapon in the field before. The mission now rests entirely on their shoulders. Mason and Goodspeed alone. With the SEAL team dead and the government on the outside scrambling to formulate a response, Mason and Goodspeed must regroup and figure out how to carry out a mission that was designed for a team of professional soldiers. The dynamic between the 2 men at this point is one of the most compelling elements of the entire film. They are completely different people from completely different worlds. Mason is old, experienced, cynical, and almost supernaturally calm under pressure. Goodspeed is young, nervous, brilliant in his specific field, and completely out of his element in every other respect. But as they move through the tunnels and passages of Alcatraz together, something begins to develop between them. Not exactly friendship at first, but a grudging mutual respect. Mason recognizes that Goodspeed is genuinely brave, even if his bravery is more born of desperation than training. Goodspeed recognizes that Mason is not simply a prisoner or a criminal. He is a man of tremendous ability and buried principle who has been profoundly wronged by the same institutions that Goodspeed has spent his career serving. There is a fascinating moral conversation happening beneath the surface of all the action, about loyalty, justice, institutional betrayal, and what it means to do the right thing when the system around you has failed completely. As they move through the island, they locate the VX rocket launchers one by one. Each rocket contains a glass ball filled with the nerve agent, and the process of neutralizing them requires Goodspeed to carefully extract and destroy each glass ball without breaking it in the process. Breaking one of these balls would release the nerve agent immediately. The tension during these sequences is nearly unbearable. Goodspeed is working under extreme time pressure, with soldiers nearby and the constant threat of discovery, performing delicate chemical work that requires a steady hand and absolute concentration. The fracture within Hummel's camp. While Mason and Goodspeed are working their way through the island, a deeply important conflict is developing within Hummel's own group. As the deadline approaches and the government shows no signs of meeting his demands, Hummel begins to reveal something that was always true about him but that his more ruthless followers did not fully appreciate. He never actually intended to launch the rockets. His entire operation was designed as a bluff, a desperate an extreme measure to force the government to acknowledge what it had done to his men and to provide some measure of justice for their families. He was willing to terrorize an entire city, but he was never willing to actually murder 70,000 innocent civilians. His two captains, Fry and Darrow, do not share this reluctance. They are mercenaries in the truest sense of the word. They joined this operation for the money and nothing else. When it becomes clear that Hummel is wavering, that he is pulling back from the edge rather than following through on the threat, Fry and Darrow decide to take matters into their own hands. They launch one of the VX rockets themselves, aiming it towards San Francisco in open defiance of Hummel's hesitation. This act tears the operation apart from the inside. Hummel and the men who are loyal to him turn against Fry and Darrow, and a violent confrontation breaks out among the soldiers themselves. It is in this moment of chaos that Hummel's true character is fully revealed. He destroys the remaining rockets himself to prevent them from being launched. He has crossed the moral line by taking hostages and threatening mass murder, but in the end, he cannot bring himself to actually do it. He misdirects the launched rocket so that it does not hit the populated city, and the gas is released harmlessly over the open water of the bay. Hummel then turns to face Goodspeed, wounded and defeated, and in a final act of conscience, he hands over the location of the last rocket ball, giving Goodspeed what he needs to complete the neutralization. Mason finds and kills Fry and Darrow before they can cause further catastrophe. Hummel himself is shot and killed during the final confrontation, dying not as a monster but as a man who went too far in the service of a cause that was, at its root, entirely just. The tragedy of Francis Hummel is one of the most genuinely affecting elements of this film. The finale and resolution. With the VX rockets neutralized and the rogue soldiers either dead or surrendering, the immediate crisis is over. But the situation outside is far from resolved. The Pentagon, unwilling to acknowledge the full details of what has happened on that island, has ordered a military airstrike on Alcatraz using thermite plasma bombs. The strike is designed to destroy all evidence of the operation, including any survivors. Mason and Goodspeed are still on the island when this order is given. In a desperate race against time, Goodspeed gets hold of the green signal flares that would tell the incoming aircraft that the mission was a success and that the strike should be called off. He sprints through the burning, collapsing structures of Alcatraz with the clock running down to seconds, reaches an exposed position, and fires the flares just in time. The aircraft abort the strike at the last possible moment. San Francisco is safe. The hostages are rescued. The mission, against every conceivable odd, has succeeded. In the aftermath, the FBI moves in to clean everything up. Mason, who has survived everything and delivered on every promise made to him, is brought before Womack. The FBI director, in a deeply cynical move, informs Goodspeed that Mason was killed in the airstrike. He then asks Goodspeed if Mason revealed the location of the stolen microfilm during their time together. Goodspeed, in a small but deeply satisfying act of defiance, claims that Mason did not. But earlier in the film, during a quiet moment between the two men, Mason had indeed whispered the location to Goodspeed. It is in a church in a specific city, and Goodspeed knows exactly where it is. In the final scene, Goodspeed and Carla are seen driving toward that location. Goodspeed has chosen to honor Mason and to pursue the truth, rather than hand it over to the same institutional forces that imprisoned Mason for 30 years without cause. The film ends on this note of quiet defiance and moral resolution. John Mason, we understand, is not dead. He has been given his freedom at last, slipping away into the world that was denied to him for so long. And somewhere out there, he may finally get to meet his daughter. And that is the complete story of The Rock from 1996. A film about justice, sacrifice, institutional betrayal, and two completely different men who find each other in the most impossible of circumstances and somehow manage to save a city together. The Rock, 1996, actor's complete life history. Sean Connery. Sean Connery was born on August 25, 1930, in Fountainbridge, Edinburgh, Scotland. His full name was Thomas Sean Connery, and he came into the world in circumstances that were about as far removed from Hollywood glamour as it is possible to imagine. His father, Joseph Connery, worked as a factory laborer and a truck driver, and his mother, Euphemia McBain, was a cleaning woman. The family lived in a small, modest tenement apartment in one of Edinburgh's working-class neighborhoods, and money was always tight. Sean grew up understanding from a very early age that if he wanted anything in life, he was going to have to go out and earn it himself. He left school at the age of 13, which was not unusual for working-class boys of his era, and immediately began taking on whatever work he could find. He delivered milk in the early morning hours before most people were even awake. He worked as a laborer. He polished coffins for a funeral home. He did odd jobs and manual work of all kinds, developing the physical toughness and practical resilience that would define his character for the rest of his life. At the age of 16, he joined the Royal Navy, seeking adventure and a way out of the grinding poverty of his childhood. He served for 3 years but was discharged early on medical grounds due to a stomach ulcer. He returned to Edinburgh without a clear path forward and began doing whatever work was available, including working as a lifeguard, a lorry driver, and an artist's model. It was during this period of drifting and searching that Connery began to discover something unexpected about himself. He started bodybuilding seriously, developing an impressive physique that would eventually lead him to compete in the 1950 Mr. Universe contest in London. He did not win, but he placed well enough to gain attention, and it was at this competition that he encountered a representative for a touring stage production of the musical South Pacific. He was offered a small role in the chorus, and this moment, almost accidental and entirely unplanned, was the beginning of everything that followed. Connery threw himself into acting with the same determination he had applied to every other challenge in his life. He was not a trained actor. He had no formal education beyond his early teenage years. But he was hungry, disciplined, and possessed of a natural charisma and physical presence that commanded attention in any room he entered. He began taking on small roles in British theatre and television throughout the early and mid-1950s, slowly building his skills and his reputation. He appeared in various BBC television productions and took on minor film roles, learning his craft through sheer experience and relentless work. His early film appearances were largely unremarkable, small parts in forgettable productions, but Connery was absorbing everything around him and growing steadily as a performer. He studied, observed more experienced actors, and worked constantly on refining his natural abilities. By the late 1950s, he was beginning to attract more serious attention within the British film industry, and it was becoming clear to those paying close attention that this young Scotsman had something genuinely special and indefinable about him. Then came the role that changed everything and defined an era. In 1962, producer Albert Broccoli and director Terence Young were preparing the first film adaptation of Ian Fleming's James Bond novels. The film was Dr. No, and they needed an actor to play the most sophisticated, charming, dangerous, and irresistible secret agent in the history of popular fiction. Many established and well-known actors of the time were considered and passed over. Sean Connery, still a relatively unknown face with a thick Scottish accent and a working-class background, was not the obvious choice. But something about him was exactly right. He had the physicality, the cool confidence, the hint of danger beneath the surface, and an almost magnetic screen presence that the role demanded. Connery became James Bond, and James Bond made Sean Connery one of the most famous men on the planet. Dr. No was a massive success, and the films that followed, including From Russia with Love in 1963, Goldfinger in 1964, Thunderball in 1965, and You Only Live Twice in 1967, turned him into a global superstar of the highest order. Goldfinger in particular became a cultural phenomenon, embedding the image of Sean Connery as Bond so deeply into the popular consciousness that it has never fully faded even decades later. He was suave, tough, witty, dangerous, and effortlessly charming in a way that felt entirely natural rather than performed. However, fame on this scale comes with its own particular prison, and Connery grew increasingly frustrated and constrained by the Bond role. He felt that the overwhelming success of the character was threatening to swallow him whole, reducing him in the public mind to nothing more than a fictional spy in a tuxedo. He walked away from the official Bond series after You Only Live Twice in 1967, attempting to establish himself as a serious dramatic actor with a wider range. He returned once more for Diamonds Are Forever in 1971 for a substantial financial offer, and then again for the unofficial production Never Say Never Again in 1983, but his heart was never truly in these returns. What he wanted was to be taken seriously as an actor beyond the Bond mythology. This period of his career in the late 1960s and through the 1970s was genuinely difficult. He took on a wide variety of roles in an attempt to demonstrate his range, appearing in films of wildly varying quality. Some were interesting creative choices, others were less successful, and the box office results were inconsistent. There were genuine critical successes, including The Man Who Would Be King in 1975, where he starred alongside Michael Caine in John Huston's magnificent adventure film, and The Wind and the Lion in 1975. But there were also films that simply did not connect with audiences, and there were years when it seemed possible that Connery might never fully escape Bond's long shadow. The true turning point of his post-Bond career came in 1987 when he appeared in The Untouchables, Brian De Palma's stylish and powerful crime film about Eliot Ness and the pursuit of Al Capone. Connery played Jim Malone, a veteran Irish-American cop who becomes Ness's mentor and moral compass. It was a supporting role, but it was a supporting performance of such extraordinary power and warmth and charisma that it earned him the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. At the age of 57, Sean Connery finally won an Oscar, and the industry and the public both seemed to exhale with collective satisfaction. It felt entirely right and long overdue. The Oscar victory opened new doors and cemented a remarkable late-career renaissance. He followed it with Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade in 1989, playing Harrison Ford's father, Henry Jones Sr., in what became one of the most beloved and entertaining father and son dynamics in blockbuster cinema history. He was funny, dignified, eccentric, and deeply touching in the role, and the film was a massive worldwide hit. Then came The Hunt for Red October in 1990, where he played Soviet submarine commander Marko Ramius with tremendous authority and quiet intensity, followed by the comedy thriller The Russia House and the romantic drama Medicine Man. By the mid-1990s, Connery had firmly established himself as one of the most respected and commercially viable actors in Hollywood, beloved by audiences across generations and possessed of a career second act that very few actors of his generation could match. It was in this context that he came to The Rock in 1996, taking on the role of John Patrick Mason and delivering a performance that many consider among the finest of his entire career. He also served as an executive producer on the film, bringing his considerable personal authority to bear both in front of and behind the camera. In the years following The Rock, Connery continued working in high-profile productions including The Avengers, Entrapment alongside Catherine Zeta-Jones, Finding Forrester, and The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen in 2003. He won a BAFTA Fellowship and a Screen Actors Guild Lifetime Achievement Award among many other honors. He was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II in the year 2000, becoming Sir Sean Connery, a recognition of his extraordinary contribution to cinema and to Scottish culture. Sean Connery retired from acting after The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, a production he had found deeply frustrating, and spent his later years living primarily in the Bahamas with his second wife, Micheline Roquebrune, whom he had married in 1975. His first marriage to actress Diane Cilento, with whom he had a son named Jason Connery, had ended in divorce in 1973. He passed away peacefully in his sleep on October 31, 2020, in Nassau, the Bahamas, at the age of 90. The world mourned him deeply and genuinely, not just as a legendary actor but as a figure who represented a particular kind of self-made, uncompromising, utterly individual human excellence. Nicolas Cage. Nicolas Cage was born Nicholas Kim Coppola on January 7, 1964, in Long Beach, California. He came into the world connected by blood to one of the most powerful and celebrated families in the history of American cinema. His uncle is Francis Ford Coppola, the legendary director of The Godfather, Apocalypse Now, and many other masterworks of American film. His aunt is the actress Talia Shire, who appeared in the Rocky films and in The Godfather. His cousin is Sofia Coppola, who became a celebrated director in her own right. Growing up inside this extraordinarily talented and prominent family gave the young Nicholas a front-row seat to the world of filmmaking from the very beginning of his conscious life. However, being born into a famous family is not the same thing as having an easy path to success, and Nicolas Cage's story is considerably more complicated and turbulent than his famous surname might suggest. He grew up in a household shaped by his father August Coppola, an academic and professor of comparative literature, and his mother Joy Vogelsang, a dancer and choreographer who suffered from serious mental health issues throughout her life. Her struggles with mental illness had a profound impact on the young Nicholas, instilling in him both a deep well of empathy and a restless, searching quality that would come to define his artistic personality. From an early age, Nicholas was consumed by a passion for acting that went far beyond any family connection or inherited ambition. He was genuinely, almost obsessively in love with the craft of performance. He studied acting at the Beverly Hills High School, where he was already demonstrating an unusual and intense approach to the work. Even as a teenager, he was pushing against conventional boundaries, experimenting with extreme physical and emotional choices, and developing an idiosyncratic style that was entirely his own and unlike anything his contemporaries were attempting. When he began his professional career, he made a decision that was both bold and deeply telling about his character. He changed his surname from Coppola to Cage, deliberately distancing himself from his uncle's legendary name. He did not want to succeed because of who his relatives were. He wanted to succeed entirely on his own terms and his own merits. The name Cage was taken partly in homage to the avant-garde composer John Cage and the Marvel Comics character Luke Cage, two references that speak volumes about his eclectic and fiercely independent artistic sensibility. His early career moved quickly. He appeared in small roles in films like Fast Times at Ridgemont High in 1982, and then began landing more substantial parts. Valley Girl in 1983 demonstrated his ability to carry a romantic comedy, and Rumble Fish in 1983, directed by his uncle Francis, showed a darker and more intense register. But it was Birdie in 1984, directed by Alan Parker, that first gave serious critics and industry insiders reason to sit up and pay full attention. Cage played El Colombato, a Vietnam veteran dealing with trauma, and he delivered a raw and genuinely fearless performance that established him as something more than just another young Hollywood face. Throughout the mid-1980s, Cage continued to take bold and unconventional choices, deliberately pursuing roles that challenged him and that most young actors of his commercial profile would have avoided. He appeared in The Cotton Club in 1984, Peggy Sue Got Married in 1986, where he famously adopted a bizarre and controversial vocal performance that many on set found maddening but that demonstrated his absolute commitment to his own creative vision, and Raising Arizona in 1987, the Coen brothers' comedy that showed his remarkable gift for physical and comedic performance. Moonstruck in 1987 brought him further mainstream attention, and Vampire's Kiss in 1989 became a cult classic of wild, unhinged performance that divided critics sharply but demonstrated beyond any doubt that Cage was operating in a creative space entirely his own. He ate a live cockroach for a scene in that film, one of many instances throughout his career where his commitment to physical and emotional authenticity crossed into territory that most performers would simply never consider. His career continued to expand and evolve through the early 1990s, with films including Wild at Heart in 1990, Honeymoon in Vegas in 1992, Red Rock West in 1993, and Guarding Tess in 1994. But the role that brought him the greatest critical recognition of his career up to that point came with Leaving Las Vegas in 1995. Mike Figgis directed this devastating and achingly beautiful film about a Hollywood screenwriter who has made a conscious decision to drink himself to death. Cage threw himself into the role with a totality and a commitment that stunned everyone who saw it. He reportedly spent time living like his character, studying the physical and psychological reality of severe alcoholism with an immersive intensity that bordered on reckless. The performance he delivered was shattering in its honesty and emotional rawness, and it earned him the Academy Award for Best Actor, the Golden Globe for Best Actor, and virtually every other major acting prize of the season. It was a performance that silenced every critic who had ever dismissed him as eccentric or self-indulgent, and it remains one of the finest pieces of screen acting in American cinema history. Coming off this triumph, Cage made a decision that surprised many people in the industry. Rather than capitalizing on his Oscar win by pursuing prestige dramatic projects, he turned toward big-budget action films. The Rock in 1996 and then Con Air and Face/Off, both released in 1997, established him as one of the most bankable action stars in Hollywood. This deliberate pivot was controversial among those who felt he was wasting his dramatic gifts, but Cage himself saw no contradiction. He approached action films with the same intensity and commitment he brought to his dramatic work, and the results were enormously successful both critically and commercially. Throughout the 2000s, Cage continued to work at a remarkable pace, appearing in an extraordinary number of films across every conceivable genre. Adaptations in 2002, directed by Charlie Kaufman and Spike Jonze, gave him another showcase for his dramatic abilities in a dual role that earned widespread critical praise. National Treasure in 2004 and its sequel became beloved adventure films that introduced him to a new generation of younger audiences. Ghost Rider, next, Bangkok Dangerous, and many others followed in rapid succession. His personal life during this period was equally eventful and often turbulent. He was married to actress Patricia Arquette from 1995 to 2001. He then married Lisa Marie Presley, the daughter of Elvis Presley, in 2002, though that marriage lasted only a matter of months. He married Alice Kim in 2004 and had a son with her named Kal-El, before that marriage also ended in divorce. His financial situation became severely troubled during the late 2000s, as he had accumulated extraordinary debts through extravagant spending on properties, rare artifacts, exotic animals, and an enormous collection of unusual and expensive objects. He owed tens of millions of dollars in back taxes and was forced to sell multiple properties, and this financial pressure contributed to his decision to take on an almost relentless number of film roles throughout the 2010s, some of which were far below his abilities. However, the story of Nicolas Cage does not end with financial difficulty or critical dismissal. His performance in Pig in 2021, a quiet and profoundly moving film about a truffle hunter searching for his stolen pig, reminded the entire world of what he is capable of when given material worthy of his abilities. The film was a critical sensation and re-established him in the eyes of many as one of the most genuinely gifted and deeply original actors of his generation. He followed it with The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent in 2022, a brilliantly self-aware and genuinely funny film in which he played a fictionalized version of himself, demonstrating not only his talent but his remarkable willingness to engage with his own public persona in the most direct and playful possible way. Nicolas Cage remains one of the most singular and fascinating figures in the entire history of American cinema. He has won the Oscar, delivered performances of shattering emotional power, reinvented himself as an action star, weathered enormous financial and personal difficulties, and emerged on the other side still working, still searching, still refusing to play it safe. Ed Harris. Ed Harris was born Edward Allen Harris on November 28, 1950, in Englewood, New Jersey. He grew up in Tenafly, New Jersey, in a stable and comfortable middle-class household. His father, Robert Lee Harris, was a business executive, and his mother, Margaret, was a homemaker. Ed was the second of 3 children, and his upbringing was by all accounts a relatively ordinary and grounded one, without the dramatic family circumstances that shaped many of his contemporaries in the acting world. He attended Columbia University in New York City, where he initially studied English. However, the pull of acting proved impossible to resist, and he transferred to the University of Oklahoma, which had a strong theater program. It was here that he began to develop seriously as a stage actor, immersing himself in the craft and discovering that the theater was where he truly belonged. He subsequently attended the California Institute of the Arts, where he refined his skills further and prepared himself for a professional career. Harris began working in theater and television in the late 1970s, building a reputation as an extraordinarily skilled and deeply committed stage actor. His theater work was always central to his identity as an artist, and throughout his career he has returned to the stage repeatedly even as his film career grew to enormous heights. There is something about the discipline and immediacy of live theater that has always fed something essential in his artistic nature. His breakthrough in film came with a role that announced his presence to the wider world in the most dramatic fashion possible. In The Right Stuff in 1983, Philip Kaufman's magnificent epic about the early American space program, Harris played astronaut John Glenn with a quiet dignity, heroism, and emotional intelligence that was simply breathtaking. The film was a critical masterpiece and a considerable commercial success, and Harris's performance was universally praised as one of the finest in the film. He was suddenly a name that everyone in Hollywood knew and respected. What followed was one of the most consistently excellent careers in American cinema over the next 4 decades. Harris built his reputation on an extraordinary ability to find the full humanity in every character he played, whether hero, villain, or something far more complicated and ambiguous. He appeared in Alamo Bay in 1985, Sweet Dreams in 1985, and Glengarry Glen Ross in 1992, where he was part of one of the finest ensemble casts ever assembled for an American film. He played Jackson Pollock in Pollock in 2000, a film he also directed himself, delivering a raw and physically transformed performance that earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. The nomination was the 3rd of his career. He had previously been nominated for Best Supporting Actor for Apollo 13 in 1995, where he played flight director Gene Kranz in a performance of enormous authority and controlled intensity, and he would later receive a 4th nomination for Best Supporting Actor for The Hours in 2002. For Academy Award nominations across different categories is an achievement that places him in extraordinarily rare company in the history of the Academy. And what is perhaps most remarkable about these nominations is that each one came for a completely different kind of performance in a completely different kind of film. He is not an actor with a signature style or a recognizable bag of tricks. He is an actor who disappears completely into each role and finds something entirely new and entirely truthful every single time. His performance as General Francis Hummel in The Rock deserves particular attention in the context of his career. The role could easily have been a simple villain part, a two-dimensional antagonist whose sole function was to threaten and intimidate. In the hands of a lesser actor, Hummel might have been forgotten the moment the credits rolled. But Harris brought such genuine emotional depth and moral complexity to the character that he became, for many viewers, the most interesting and affecting presence in the entire film. You understood Hummel's rage. You felt his grief. You recognized the justice buried inside his terrible plan. This kind of alchemy, transforming what is essentially a villain role into something genuinely tragic and human, is the rarest and most impressive gift an actor can possess. In the years since The Rock, Ed Harris has continued to work with remarkable consistency and quality. He appeared in Truman in 1995, playing Harry Truman in a television film that earned him an Emmy Award. He appeared in A Beautiful Mind in 2001, Enemy at the Gates in 2001, The Human Stain in 2003, A History of Violence in 2005, and Gone Baby Gone in 2007, among many others. He joined the cast of the HBO science fiction series Westworld in 2016, playing the enigmatic and deeply sinister Man in Black, a role that brought him to an entirely new generation of fans and demonstrated yet again his ability to make complex and morally ambiguous characters absolutely riveting to watch. Ed Harris married actress Amy Madigan in 1983, and the two have remained together ever since, one of the most enduring and apparently genuinely happy partnerships in the entertainment industry. They have one daughter together, named Lily. Harris has maintained a remarkably grounded and private personal life throughout his career, staying away from the tabloid spectacle that surrounds many of his peers and focusing his energy and attention on his work and his family. He has spoken in interviews about the importance of craft and discipline in acting, about the necessity of doing the work properly rather than relying on instinct or charisma alone, and his entire career stands as living proof of those principles. Ed Harris is widely regarded by his peers and by critics as one of the finest screen actors that American cinema has ever produced. He has never won the Oscar despite 4 nominations, which is one of the more surprising oversights in the Academy's long history. But his legacy is secure and his body of work is a testament to what is possible when extraordinary natural talent is combined with absolute dedication, rigorous craft, and an unwavering commitment to honesty in performance. The Rock, 1996, budget, making and funny scenes on set. The budget and how the money was spent. The Rock was made on a production budget of $75 million, which in 1996 was considered a very substantial sum of money for an action film. To put this in perspective, $75 million in 1996 carries a value of well over $150 million in today's money when adjusted for inflation. This was not a small gamble. This was a massive financial commitment by Hollywood Pictures and the Don Simpson and Jerry Bruckheimer production company, and every single dollar of that budget can be seen on screen in one way or another. The bulk of the budget was consumed by several major categories of expenditure. The first and most significant was the sheer scale of the physical production itself. Filming on location at Alcatraz Island was not a simple or cheap operation. Alcatraz is a federally protected historical site sitting in the middle of San Francisco Bay, and gaining permission to film there required extensive negotiation with the federal government, the National Park Service, and multiple other regulatory bodies. The logistics of transporting cast, crew, equipment, cameras, lighting rigs, catering operations, and everything else a major Hollywood production requires out to an island every single day was enormously expensive and complicated. Boats had to be chartered constantly. Equipment had to be waterproofed and carefully managed in a marine environment. The weather over San Francisco Bay is notoriously unpredictable, with fog, wind, and cold temperatures capable of shutting down a shoot without warning. All of these factors drove costs upward on a daily basis. The second major area of expenditure was the special effects and pyrotechnics budget, which was enormous even by the standards of mid-1990s blockbuster filmmaking. Michael Bay is a director who has always had a particular and passionate relationship with practical explosions, and The Rock contains some of the most spectacular and elaborately choreographed explosion sequences in the history of the action genre. The pyrotechnics team worked for months preparing and executing these sequences, and many of them required multiple takes and multiple setups, each of which consumed significant resources. The underwater sequences required a specially constructed tank large enough to accommodate the underwater mine scenes, which alone represented a substantial construction and engineering cost. The helicopter sequences used real military-style helicopters flying actual routes over and around Alcatraz and San Francisco Bay, which required extensive coordination with aviation authorities and added considerably to the budget. The car chase sequence through the streets of San Francisco, which is one of the film's most beloved and spectacular set pieces, cost a remarkable amount of money to execute. Filming a high-speed chase through the actual streets of a major American city requires the kind of production infrastructure that most people outside the film industry never fully appreciate. Entire city blocks must be secured and closed to regular traffic, which requires coordination with local police departments, city governments, and traffic authorities. Hundreds of production crew members must be positioned along the route. Stunt drivers must rehearse the sequence meticulously. Camera vehicles must be choreographed with the same precision as the stunt vehicles themselves. Multiple cameras must be positioned at multiple angles simultaneously to capture the necessary coverage. And then, when actual cars are damaged or destroyed during the chase, which they inevitably are, replacement vehicles must be sourced and prepared. The Ferrari that Sean Connery's character drives during this sequence, and which gets extensively damaged during the chase, was a real Ferrari, and multiple versions of it had to be prepared for the various stages and angles of the sequence. The cast salaries also represented a major portion of the budget. Sean Connery was one of the highest-paid actors in Hollywood at the time, and his fee for The Rock was reported to be in the range of $12 million, which was an extraordinary sum even for a star of his magnitude. Nicolas Cage, fresh off his Academy Award win for Leaving Las Vegas, commanded a significant salary as well, reportedly in the range of $7 to $8 million. Ed Harris, while somewhat less expensive than his two leads, was still a major and respected star whose participation did not come cheap. When you add up the salaries of the supporting cast, the director's fee, the producer fees, the cinematographer, the editor, the composer, and all the other key creative personnel, the above-the-line costs alone consumed a very substantial portion of that $75 million total. The music budget was also considerable. Hans Zimmer, Nick Glennie Smith, and Harry Gregson Williams composed a score of genuine scope and power, and recording an orchestral film score of that magnitude with a full orchestra in a professional recording studio is an expensive undertaking. The iconic main theme and all the supporting musical pieces required extensive recording sessions, and the final score represents hundreds of hours of orchestral performance and studio time. Post-production costs, including the editing, the visual effects work, the sound mixing and sound design, and the color grading, added further millions to the total. The sound design of The Rock was considered exceptional by industry standards, and the film was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Sound, which is a testament to the quality and the cost of the work that went into it. The visual effects team, working with the technology available in 1995 and 1996, used a combination of practical miniatures and early computer-generated imagery to create some of the more spectacular sequences, and this kind of work does not come cheaply. The final result of all this expenditure was a film that earned $335 million worldwide against its $75 million budget, representing one of the most profitable returns on investment in Hollywood history for that year. The domestic gross alone was approximately $134 million, meaning the film made back nearly double its entire production budget just from American theaters before a single dollar of international box office was counted. On top of all this, home video sales, television rights, and ancillary revenues added enormously to the film's overall financial success. By any measure, The Rock was not just an artistic success. It was a financial triumph of the first order. The making of The Rock. The production of The Rock was, by all accounts, one of the most intense, and logistically challenging shoots in Hollywood history during the mid-1990s. Michael Bay was only 31 years old when he directed the film, and it was only his second feature as a director, following Bad Boys in 1995. The scale of the undertaking was genuinely enormous for a filmmaker of any experience level, let alone someone who was still in the earliest stages of building his directorial career. Bay brought to the project the same relentless, high-energy approach that had characterized his work in music videos and commercials, pushing his cast and crew at a pace that was demanding by any standard. The screenplay itself went through an extraordinary number of rewrites before filming began, and the writing process was one of the more unusual and colorful aspects of the entire production. The original story was conceived by David Weisberg and Douglas S. Cook, and they wrote the initial screenplay. However, it quickly became clear to the producers that the script needed significant work, and a series of additional writers were brought in to address various elements. Jonathan Hensleigh, who was an experienced action screenwriter, came in and wrote what became known as the shooting script, the version of the screenplay that was actually used as the primary working document during production. However, Hensleigh was ultimately not credited on the final film, a decision that deeply aggrieved him and that he spoke about publicly in later years. Perhaps the most surprising writing contribution came from Quentin Tarantino, who was at the absolute peak of his cultural influence in the mid-1990s following the massive success of Pulp Fiction in 1994. Tarantino came in and contributed significantly to the dialogue and the tone of certain sections of the film, particularly the banter and verbal exchanges between characters. His contribution helped give the script a sharper, wittier, more irreverent quality that sits alongside the explosive action and gives the film much of its distinctive personality. Tarantino received no screen credit for this work, which is not unusual in Hollywood where uncredited writing contributions are extremely common, but his fingerprints are visible throughout the finished film for anyone who knows where to look. Additionally, Sean Connery himself was unhappy with certain aspects of his dialogue as written, and he exercised his considerable personal authority as both the lead actor and an executive producer to arrange for his own personal script doctors to be brought in. He specifically requested the British screenwriting team of Dick Clement and Ian La Frenais, who were longtime friends and trusted collaborators. Clement and La Frenais were brought in ostensibly to polish Connery's lines, but they ended up rewriting a significant portion of the film's dialogue across multiple characters, substantially altering the conversational texture of the entire production. This kind of multiple writer situation, with different writers working on different elements simultaneously and their contributions blending together in the final product, is actually quite common in major Hollywood productions of this scale, but The Rock represented a particularly extreme version of it. The actual filming on Alcatraz presented challenges that no amount of pre-production planning could fully anticipate or resolve. The island is a genuinely hostile filming environment in many respects. The buildings are old, deteriorating, and structurally unpredictable in places. The weather, as mentioned earlier, is a constant variable that cannot be controlled. The marine environment means that salt air and moisture are constantly threatening sensitive equipment. And the fact that Alcatraz remained open to tourists throughout much of the filming period, with visitors watching the production from various vantage points around the island, created an additional layer of complexity that the production team had to manage on a daily basis. One of the most extraordinary aspects of the production was the premiere of the completed film. Rather than holding a conventional premiere at a movie theater in Los Angeles or New York, the filmmakers arranged for the world premiere of The Rock to be held in the prison recreation yard on Alcatraz Island itself. This was an inspired and genuinely spectacular choice, creating an event that was as memorable and theatrical as anything in the film itself, and it demonstrated the deep and authentic connection between this production and this extraordinary location. The film was dedicated to producer Don Simpson, who died of a drug overdose on January 19, 1996, 5 months before the film was released in theaters. Simpson had been one of the most powerful and influential producers in Hollywood throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, responsible alongside Jerry Bruckheimer for a string of massive hits including Flashdance, Beverly Hills Cop, Top Gun, and Crimson Tide. His death during post-production of The Rock was a deeply sad and shocking moment for everyone who had worked with him, and the dedication at the end of the film is a genuine tribute to a complicated but undeniably important figure in Hollywood history. Funny and memorable behind-the-scenes moments. Now this is where the story of The Rock gets genuinely entertaining, because the behind-the-scenes reality of this production was filled with moments that were as colorful, chaotic, and laugh-out-loud funny as anything that ended up in the finished film. The combination of Sean Connery's legendary personality, Nicolas Cage's boundless eccentricity, and Michael Bay's barely controlled directorial energy created an on-set atmosphere that was reportedly equal parts intense and absolutely hilarious. One of the most famous and beloved behind-the-scenes stories involves Sean Connery and his approach to the Disney executives who were overseeing the production on behalf of Hollywood Pictures. Michael Bay, being a young and relatively unproven director taking on a massively expensive film, was under constant pressure and scrutiny from studio executives who were nervous about his decisions and the pace of the production. On one particular occasion, Bay was preparing to leave the set to attend a meeting with these executives, fully expecting it to be a difficult and uncomfortable confrontation about his handling of the production. He was walking toward his car when Connery appeared beside him, wearing full golfing attire, complete with the sweater and the whole look, and casually asked where Bay was going. When Bay explained that he had a meeting with the Disney executives and that they were giving him trouble, Connery simply said, without any drama or ceremony, that he would come along. Bay, somewhat stunned, agreed. They drove to the meeting together. When Bay walked into the conference room where the Disney executives were seated and waiting to apply pressure, and Connery strolled in right behind him dressed for a golf course, the jaws of every single person in that room dropped simultaneously. The room went completely silent. Nobody had been expecting Sean Connery, and nobody in that room was going to argue with Sean Connery. Connery then proceeded to tell the assembled executives, in that unmistakable voice, that Michael Bay was doing an exceptional job and that they should leave him alone and let him make the film. And that was essentially the end of the confrontation. The executives backed down completely. Bay has told this story many times in interviews and on commentary tracks, and he does so with obvious and deep gratitude for the moment. It is one of the most perfectly Connery things that Sean Connery ever did in his entire life. Connery's on-set behavior was a constant source of entertainment for the entire cast and crew. He had a reputation for being extraordinarily particular about his personal comfort and his working conditions, and he pursued these requirements with a completely unapologetic and almost regal confidence that nobody on set had any interest in challenging. He reportedly requested permission from the Coast Guard to anchor a personal yacht off the dock of Alcatraz so that he would have a comfortable place to retreat to between setups without having to travel back to the mainland and his hotel. The Coast Guard denied this request, apparently not being especially moved by the fact that it was James Bond asking. Connery settled for spending time in his trailer on the island instead, but the image of him negotiating with the United States Coast Guard over yacht parking privileges is one that has become part of the film's enduring legend. Nicolas Cage brought his own particular brand of chaotic energy to the production. Cage is famously one of the most committed and immersive actors in the business, known for going to extraordinary lengths to prepare for and inhabit his roles. On The Rock, he reportedly stayed fully in character as the anxious, socially awkward, slightly nerdy Dr. Stanley Goodspeed throughout the filming period to an extent that his co-stars and the crew found equal parts impressive and bewildering. There were apparently multiple occasions on set where Cage would launch into extended improvised monologues or physical bits that had nothing to do with what was written in the script but that were completely in keeping with the nervous, twitchy, overly intellectual personality of his character. Some of these improvisations were so genuinely funny and so perfectly right for the film that Michael Bay kept them in, and they ended up in the finished movie. In fact, according to Bay himself, the majority of the film's humorous moments and comedic lines were not written in the script at all but were improvised during filming. This is a remarkable fact for a film of this scale and budget, where every day of shooting costs enormous amounts of money, and there is theoretically very little room for spontaneous experimentation. The dynamic between Connery and Cage on set was reportedly as entertaining as their chemistry on screen, perhaps more so. Connery, at 65 years old during the shoot, was a figure of such enormous personal authority and experience that he occupied a completely different psychological space than everyone around him. Cage, who was 31 and operating at the absolute peak of his early career confidence following his Oscar win, was in many ways Connery's opposite, high energy where Connery was contained, nervous where Connery was assured, frantically active where Connery was deliberately still. The two men apparently got along extremely well personally, with a genuine mutual respect and affection, but their working styles were so different that watching them navigate scenes together was its own entertainment for the crew. Connery's approach was precise, economical, and deeply considered. Cage's approach was exploratory, instinctive, and occasionally unpredictable. Somehow, in the context of the film, these completely opposite approaches produced a chemistry that was absolutely electric. There was also a great deal of humor generated by the sheer physical absurdity of certain scenes during production. The action sequences, which look so sleek and controlled in the finished film, were apparently quite chaotic and often genuinely ridiculous to witness from the crew's perspective during filming. Watching Nicolas Cage sprint through the tunnels of Alcatraz at full speed for the 15th take in a row, while explosions went off around him and the pyrotechnics team prepared yet another setup, apparently generated a particular kind of exhausted, delirious laughter among the people watching. Action filmmaking at this scale is such an inherently absurd enterprise that it tends to produce its own comedy simply through the contrast between how seriously everyone is taking everything and how objectively strange the entire situation looks from the outside. Michael Bay's directorial personality also contributed significantly to the atmosphere on set. Bay is famous for his enormous energy, his absolute certainty about his creative vision, his willingness to push cast and crew to their absolute limits, and his rather spectacular temper when things were not going the way he wanted them to go. He is not a quiet or contemplative director. He is a director who operates at full volume and full intensity at all times, and on a production as logistically complex and physically demanding as The Rock. This created an atmosphere of constant controlled frenzy that apparently oscillated rapidly between inspiring and absolutely exhausting. The crew, many of whom went on to work with Bay on multiple subsequent projects, have spoken about the experience with a mixture of genuine admiration for his talent and rueful laughter at the experience of surviving his methods. One particularly funny production detail involves the script itself and the way it continued to evolve throughout filming. Because so many writers had contributed to the screenplay and because Bay and the actors were constantly improvising and changing things on set, there were apparently days when different cast members were working from different versions of the script, and nobody was entirely certain which lines were the current official version. This kind of creative chaos is more common in filmmaking than audiences generally realize, but on The Rock it reached a level that was genuinely comedic. Writers were reportedly still delivering new pages to the set while cameras were rolling elsewhere on the island, and there were scenes where actors had received new dialogue so recently that they were essentially learning it minutes before performing it. The fact that the finished film feels so polished and controlled is a testament to the skill of everyone involved, because the process of making it was apparently considerably more anarchic than the result suggests. The premiere on Alcatraz Island itself, while magnificent as an event, also apparently had its share of unplanned comedic moments. Getting hundreds of guests, press representatives, and studio executives out to an island in San Francisco Bay for a film premiere is an inherently complicated operation, and the various logistical challenges involved apparently produced a number of situations that were funnier in retrospect than they were in the moment. The combination of formal attire, cold bay weather, island terrain, and the general organizational challenges of moving large numbers of people onto and off of a small island in the dark generated the kind of memorable chaos that nobody plans for but that everyone ends up remembering forever. And that is the complete story of the budget, the making, and the funny behind-the-scenes moments of The Rock. It is a film that cost $75 million, made back more than 4 times that amount, and was made by a group of extraordinarily talented and genuinely entertaining human beings who somehow managed to create a masterpiece out of controlled chaos, improvised dialogue, Connery in golf clothes walking into boardrooms, and Nicolas Cage running through tunnels at full speed for the 15th time. The Rock, 1996, complete cultural and historical details. The historical reality of Alcatraz Island. To fully understand the cultural and historical weight that The Rock carries, you first have to understand the place at the center of its story. Alcatraz Island is not simply a dramatic filming location chosen for its visual appeal. It is one of the most historically layered and symbolically powerful pieces of land in the entire United States of America, and its history stretches back long before it ever became a prison or a movie set. The island sits in the middle of San Francisco Bay, a small, rocky, windswept piece of land roughly 1.5 miles from the San Francisco shoreline. Its name comes from the Spanish word for pelican, a reference to the seabirds that populated the island when Spanish explorer Juan Manuel de Ayala first charted it in 1775. For the earliest European settlers and explorers of the California coast, the island was little more than a navigational landmark, notable primarily for its position in the bay and its inhospitable terrain. The first significant chapter of the island's American history began when it was identified as a strategically important military position in the mid-19th century. The United States Army established a fort on the island in the 1850s, recognizing that its position in the bay made it an ideal location for controlling access to San Francisco and defending the Northern California coast. The island became the site of the first operational lighthouse on the entire west coast of the United States, a beacon that guided ships through the notoriously treacherous waters of the bay. During the Civil War, the island served as a military garrison and was used to hold Confederate prisoners and civilians suspected of disloyalty to the Union, making it one of the earliest American military prisons on the West Coast. This military history established the island's association with confinement and control that would define its public identity for the next century and beyond. The Army continued to use the island as a military prison through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, housing prisoners from various conflicts, including the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War. After the catastrophic San Francisco earthquake of 1906, when much of the city's civilian jail infrastructure was destroyed, Alcatraz briefly housed civilian prisoners as well, an early preview of its future role. The military prison continued operating through World War I, holding conscientious objectors and soldiers convicted of various offenses, and the island's reputation for isolation and impregnability grew steadily throughout this entire period. The chapter of Alcatraz history that defined its global reputation began in 1934, when the United States Department of Justice converted the existing military prison into a federal penitentiary designed specifically to house the most dangerous, escape-prone, and unmanageable criminals in the American federal prison system. The thinking behind Alcatraz as a federal penitentiary was straightforward and deliberately punitive. Other federal prisons were struggling to contain a new generation of high-profile, organized, and violent criminals, many of whom were products of the Prohibition era and the rise of organized crime in American cities. These prisoners were corrupting other inmates, bribing guards, and in some cases successfully escaping. Alcatraz was conceived as the answer to all of these problems. Put the worst of the worst on an island in the middle of a freezing, current-swept bay, surrounded by water so cold and so treacherous that swimming to shore was considered essentially impossible, and the problem of escape would be solved. The penitentiary opened on August 11, 1934, and over the course of the next 3 decades, it housed some of the most infamous criminals in American history. Al Capone, the legendary Chicago mob boss, was transferred to Alcatraz in 1934 and spent several years there, his health steadily declining due to untreated syphilis. George Kelly, known as Machine Gun Kelly, one of the most colorful and feared gangsters of the Prohibition era, was held at Alcatraz for many years. Robert Stroud, known as the Birdman of Alcatraz, spent decades at the prison and became one of its most famous inhabitants through the 1962 film about his life. Alvin Karpis, once named Public Enemy No. 1 by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, spent more time at Alcatraz than any other inmate, serving over 25 years on the island. The prison operated on a philosophy of rigid routine, minimal privileges, and absolute security. Inmates were allowed virtually no freedoms beyond the basic necessities of life. The cells were small, cold, and uncomfortable. The work was monotonous. The isolation from the outside world was nearly total. The objective was not rehabilitation but containment, a message sent loudly and clearly to the criminal underworld that the most dangerous and disruptive offenders would be removed from society and held in conditions that offered no comfort and no hope of escape. The question of escape from Alcatraz became one of the defining legends of American criminal history. Over the course of the prison's 29 years of operation, there were 14 known escape attempts involving 36 prisoners. Of these, 23 were caught, 6 were shot and killed during their attempts, 2 drowned, and 5 were officially listed as missing and presumed drowned, though their bodies were never recovered. The most famous and enduring escape attempt came in June 1962, when Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin disappeared from their cells through holes carefully dug through the cell walls and made their way to the water. Their fate has never been conclusively determined. Official records list them as presumed drowned, but the case has never been officially closed, and the mystery of what happened to them has fascinated historians, criminologists, and the general public for more than 60 years. It was this mythology of escape and impregnability that The Rock drew upon directly for the character of John Mason, the only man who successfully escaped from Alcatraz. The federal penitentiary closed on March 21, 1963, primarily because it was extremely expensive to operate. Everything, including food, water, and fuel, had to be transported to the island by boat, making Alcatraz far more costly to run than comparable mainland facilities. Attorney General Robert Kennedy ordered the closure, and the last prisoners were transferred to other federal facilities. The island stood largely empty for several years, its buildings slowly beginning to deteriorate in the harsh bay weather. Then came one of the most politically charged and historically significant chapters of the island's story, one that is often overlooked in the popular imagination that associates Alcatraz purely with its prison history. From November 1969 to June 1971, a group of Native American activists occupied Alcatraz Island in one of the most dramatic and symbolically powerful protests of the entire civil rights era. The group, which called itself Indians of All Tribes, claimed the island under the terms of an 1868 treaty that they argued entitled Native Americans to claim unused federal land. At its peak, the occupation involved hundreds of people and attracted massive national and international media attention. The occupiers demanded that the island be converted into a Native American cultural center and university. The occupation lasted 19 months before federal marshals removed the final remaining protesters, but its impact on the Native American civil rights movement was enormous and lasting. This episode added another layer of historical and political meaning to the island that was already extraordinarily rich in American historical significance. Alcatraz became part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area in 1972 and has been open to the public as a tourist attraction ever since. It draws over 1 million visitors per year and is one of the most visited sites in the entire United States National Park System. The island, the prison buildings, and the surrounding waters are all federally protected, which is why filming The Rock on location there required such extensive negotiation and why the National Park Service imposed strict conditions on the production, including restrictions that force much of the night shooting to accommodate the continued flow of tourists during the day. The historical and political themes in The Rock. The Rock is not simply an action film that uses a historically significant location as a backdrop. It is a film that is deeply engaged with specific historical and political themes that were very much alive and unresolved in the mid-1990s when it was made, and understanding these themes transforms your experience of watching it from simple entertainment into something considerably more interesting and meaningful. The central premise of the film, a decorated military general turning against the government that he served out of rage at its treatment of soldiers who died on classified covert operations, was not invented from whole cloth. Producer Don Simpson was deeply inspired by real historical figures and real documented grievances when developing the character of General Hummel. The most direct inspiration was Colonel David H. Hackworth, one of the most decorated American soldiers of the 20th century and a genuine military legend who became one of the most outspoken and passionate critics of the United States military establishment and government after his retirement from service. Hackworth was profoundly and publicly furious about the way the American government had treated the soldiers who fought in Vietnam, particularly those involved in classified operations who were disavowed by their government, and whose sacrifices were never officially acknowledged. His memoirs and his public advocacy for abandoned veterans provided the emotional and moral foundation for the Hummel character. Simpson also drew inspiration from documented cases that had been exposed in media investigations, including a specific segment on the television program 60 Minutes that detailed the real and deeply disturbing practice of the United States military disavowing soldiers who had been sent on covert missions in foreign countries. When these operations went wrong, when soldiers were captured or killed, the government's standard response was to officially deny any knowledge of the mission and to leave the soldiers and their families without any official recognition, compensation, or support. This was not a fictional conspiracy invented for the purposes of a thriller. It was a documented reality of American military and intelligence practice during the Cold War era, and the anger that it generated among the military community was genuine, deep, and entirely justified. The Rock gave cinematic voice to this anger in a way that resonated powerfully with audiences, many of whom were aware of this dark chapter of American military history. The film was made in 1995 and released in 1996, at a very particular and historically specific moment in American cultural and political life. The Cold War had ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the United States was navigating the complex and disorienting experience of being the world's sole superpower without a clear ideological enemy to define itself against. The great certainties of the Cold War era, the clear division of the world into opposing camps with the United States standing as the defender of freedom against Soviet communism, had dissolved, leaving behind a landscape of moral ambiguity and unresolved historical grievances. In this context, the threat in The Rock was not a foreign enemy. It was not a Soviet agent or a terrorist from some hostile nation. The threat came from within, from an American military officer of the highest distinction who had been failed by the very system he devoted his life to serving. This was a deeply resonant choice for a film made in the mid-1990s, when American culture was in the midst of a profound reckoning with the legacy of Vietnam, with the treatment of veterans, and with the gap between the noble self-image of American military power and the often darker reality of how that power was actually exercised. The character of Hummel embodied this reckoning in a way that was angry, compassionate, and entirely human. The specific threat in the film, chemical weapons in the form of VX nerve gas, also had enormous historical resonance in the mid-1990s. The use of chemical weapons in warfare is one of the most ancient and persistent horrors of human conflict, stretching back to the use of poison gases in the trenches of World War I. The modern era of chemical weapons development produced agents of almost incomprehensible lethality, including the organophosphate nerve agents like VX and sarin that are referenced and depicted in The Rock. These weapons were a real and present concern in the 1990s. The Chemical Weapons Convention, an international treaty prohibiting the development, production, stockpiling, and use of chemical weapons, was negotiated in the early 1990s and opened for signature in 1993. It entered into force in April 1997, just 1 year after The Rock was released. The film was therefore engaging directly with one of the most pressing arms control issues of its historical moment. The Rock and the Iraq War, a remarkable historical connection. Perhaps the most extraordinary and genuinely astonishing piece of historical information connected to The Rock is the documented role that the film played, in a small but real and officially acknowledged way, in the events leading up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. This is not speculation or conspiracy theory. It is a matter of official public record, documented in one of the most comprehensive and authoritative government investigations in modern British history. The Chilcot Inquiry, formerly known as the Iraq Inquiry, was a British public inquiry into the United Kingdom's role in the Iraq War. It was chaired by Sir John Chilcot and produced a final report in July 2016 that ran to approximately 2.5 million words and represented the most exhaustive official examination of the decision to go to war in Iraq that any government has ever conducted. Within this report, amid the vast documentation of intelligence failures, political decisions, and military planning, there is a passage that has to be read to be believed. The report documents how British intelligence agencies, specifically MI6, received reports in 2002 suggesting that Iraq possessed chemical weapons stored in glass containers. These intelligence reports were used as part of the justification for the case that Iraq represented a threat requiring military intervention. When intelligence analysts examined these reports more carefully, questions were raised about the credibility of the claim that nerve agents were being stored in glass containers, because this is not how chemical weapons are actually manufactured or stored in reality. It was then pointed out, in an official intelligence assessment, that a popular Hollywood movie had depicted nerve agents being carried in glass beads or spheres, and that this fictional depiction from the film appeared to have influenced or contaminated the intelligence reporting. That popular Hollywood movie was, of course, The Rock. The depiction of VX nerve gas stored in glass balls in The Rock was a creative invention of the screenplay, not based on any actual chemical weapons technology or practice. Real nerve agents are not stored in glass spheres. But this fictional detail from a 1996 Michael Bay action film apparently made its way, through channels that the Chilcot Inquiry was never able to fully trace, into British intelligence reporting about Iraqi chemical weapons capabilities in 2002 and 2003. The film was so culturally pervasive, so widely seen by so many people including, apparently, intelligence sources and the individuals they were dealing with, that its fictional portrayal of how chemical weapons looked and worked was mistaken for or confused with reality in the context of real intelligence gathering. This connection between the Rock and the Iraq War is not presented as a primary cause or a major factor in the decision to invade. The Chilcot report makes clear that the intelligence failures around Iraqi weapons of mass destruction were vast and systemic. But the specific passage about the glass containers and the Hollywood movie is real, documented, and officially acknowledged. It represents one of the most genuinely strange and historically significant cultural footnotes of the entire post-Cold War period, and it gives The Rock a place in actual geopolitical history that no other action film in the 1990s can claim. Alcatraz as cultural symbol in American history. The choice of Alcatraz as the setting for The Rock was not merely a practical or visual decision. It was a deeply culturally informed choice that drew on the island's extraordinary accumulation of symbolic meaning in the American imagination. By the time The Rock was filmed, Alcatraz had spent decades functioning as one of the most powerful and resonant symbols in American popular culture, representing simultaneously the power of the state to isolate and punish, the human desire for freedom and the irrepressible will to escape, and the dark side of American institutional authority. The island's history in Hollywood goes back to the earliest years of sound cinema, with films depicting life inside its walls being made throughout the 1930s and 1940s while the prison was still operational. After its closure in 1963, Alcatraz became a location rather than a subject, a physical space charged with so much historical and symbolic meaning that simply setting a story there automatically invested it with layers of significance. Point Blank in 1967 used the deserted prison as a location for confrontation and violence in a way that drew on the island's aura of menace and abandonment. Escape from Alcatraz in 1979 with Clint Eastwood revisited the mythology of escape and institutional power. Murder in the First in 1995 explored the brutal conditions of solitary confinement on the island in a more directly historical and critical mode. The Rock sits within this lineage and extends it in a specific and interesting direction. Rather than depicting Alcatraz as a place of confinement, the film transforms it into a battlefield. The island is no longer a prison from which people are trying to escape. It is a fortress that people are trying to penetrate. This inversion of the classic Alcatraz narrative is itself culturally significant, representing a shift in how the island's symbolic power was being deployed and understood in the 1990s. The Rock takes the myth of Alcatraz's impregnability and turns it inside out, making the famous impossibility of getting out the key to exploring the equally interesting impossibility of getting in. The cultural impact of Alcatraz in American society also extends to its representation of the relationship between the American public and its institutions of punishment and control. Throughout the 20th century, Alcatraz served as a kind of psychological reassurance to the law-abiding American public, a visible demonstration that the most dangerous and threatening criminals in the country could be contained and removed from society. But it also functioned, particularly after its closure and transformation into a tourist site, as a place of fascination with transgression, with the lives of the infamous men who had been held there, with the romance of crime and punishment that runs deeply through American popular culture. The Rock engages with this ambivalence by presenting a situation in which the island is controlled not by agents of the state, but by a man who has been failed by the state. The symbolic resonance is powerful. Alcatraz, the ultimate instrument of state power and confinement, is turned against the state itself by a man whose grievance with that state is entirely legitimate and deeply rooted in documented historical injustice. This transformation of Alcatraz from symbol of state authority into symbol of justified rebellion against state authority is one of the most culturally interesting aspects of the film, and one that rewards careful attention. The film's place in 1990s action cinema history. The Rock was released at a very specific and defining moment in the history of the action genre, and understanding this context helps explain why it had such an enormous cultural impact, and why it is still discussed and celebrated nearly 3 decades after its release. The 1980s had established the template for American action cinema through a series of enormously successful films that centered on individual, physically superhuman heroes overcoming impossible odds through force of will and spectacular violence. The Rambo series, the Die Hard franchise, the Lethal Weapon films, and the various Arnold Schwarzenegger vehicles of the era all operated within this framework. The hero was larger than life, essentially invulnerable, and morally uncomplicated. The villains were clearly evil, the objectives were clearly defined, and the resolution came through the application of overwhelming physical force. By the early 1990s, this template was beginning to feel exhausted. Audiences had seen so many iterations of the formula that the individual elements had lost much of their impact. The challenge for filmmakers working in the action genre in the mid-1990s was how to reinvigorate a form that had become dangerously familiar. The Rock represented one of the most successful answers to this challenge that the decade produced. It retained the spectacular physical action sequences and the high stakes that audiences expected from the genre, but it layered over them a genuine moral complexity, a villain with a legitimate grievance, a hero who was genuinely frightened and out of his depth, and a supporting character in Mason who was neither clearly hero nor villain but something far more interesting than either. This moral and character complexity gave The Rock a depth that most action films of its era simply did not possess, and it is one of the primary reasons why the film has aged so much better than many of its contemporaries. The car chases and explosions are spectacular, but they are also, in their own way, dated, products of their specific technological and aesthetic moment. What does not date is the quality of the performances, the genuine emotional weight of the Hummel storyline, and the fascinating dynamic between Mason and Goodspeed. These elements give the film a human core that transcends the limitations of any particular filmmaking era. The Rock also represented a significant moment in the career of director Michael Bay and in the evolution of a specific visual style that would come to dominate blockbuster filmmaking for the next 2 decades. Bay's approach to action cinema, with its hyperkinetic editing, its use of low camera angles and fast-moving shots, its operatic scale, and its absolute commitment to physical spectacle, was not invented with The Rock. But it was refined and fully realized on this film in a way that had not been achieved in his debut feature. The visual language of The Rock became enormously influential on an entire generation of action filmmakers, and many of the techniques and aesthetic choices that Bay pioneered on this film can be seen echoed in action cinema produced well into the 2000s and beyond. Legacy and lasting cultural impact. The cultural legacy of The Rock in the nearly 30 years since its release has been substantial and multifaceted. The film has maintained a remarkably strong reputation among audiences and critics, continuing to appear on lists of the greatest action films ever made and attracting new generations of viewers who discover it through streaming platforms and personal recommendations. Its IMDb rating has remained consistently strong across decades of voting, which is a reliable indicator of a film that continues to connect with audiences on a genuine emotional and entertainment level rather than simply being remembered fondly for nostalgic reasons. The film's influence on popular culture extended into areas well beyond cinema. Its depiction of VX nerve gas and chemical weapons, while scientifically inaccurate in certain specific respects, as the Chilcot Report noted, shaped public understanding and imagination around chemical weapons in ways that persisted for many years. Its portrayal of Alcatraz introduced the island to a generation of younger viewers who might otherwise have had little awareness of its history, and there is credible evidence that the film contributed to the growth of Alcatraz tourism in the years following its release. The film was remade in India in 2003 as Qiamat, City Under Threat, which is a testament to its global reach and its adaptability to different cultural contexts. The basic premise, a rogue military officer threatening a major city with chemical weapons and 2 unlikely heroes attempting to stop him, proved to be universally compelling across cultural boundaries. The Rock also holds a particular and honored place in the ongoing cultural conversation about Michael Bay as a filmmaker. Bay's career has been deeply controversial, with critics frequently dismissing him as a director of empty spectacle and excessive noise who sacrifices character and meaning for visual sensation. The Rock is almost always the film cited by those who argue for a more nuanced assessment of Bay's abilities, because it demonstrates clearly that he is capable of far more than his detractors typically acknowledge. The film has genuine dramatic intelligence, genuine performances, and a genuine emotional core, qualities that are often absent from his later blockbusters. It stands as evidence of what Bay is capable of when the script, the cast, the producers, and the circumstances all align in the right way. 30 years on, The Rock remains a genuinely important cultural document. It captures a specific moment in American history, a moment of post-Cold War uncertainty, of unresolved military grievances, of anxiety about weapons of mass destruction, and of transition in popular entertainment from the simplistic heroics of the 1980s to something more morally complex and emotionally honest. It takes one of the most historically saturated locations in America and finds new meaning in it. And it delivers all of this wrapped in one of the most purely entertaining action films that Hollywood has ever produced. That is the complete cultural and historical breakdown of The Rock from 1996. A film that is connected to real military history, real Cold War grievances, a real political inquiry into a real war, and the centuries-deep history of one of the most extraordinary islands in America. If you found this video valuable and informative, please hit that thumbs up button and share it with anyone who loves great cinema and the fascinating true stories behind it. Subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss any of our upcoming content. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the very next video.